Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sara Duvnjak, and I will be your moderator for these 2 days, so today and tomorrow, in this conference room. As Alexander said, it's called Water on Creation, it's Voda. Unfortunately, today's conference will not be opened by Mr. Chen Nassib. He's unfortunately unable to join us, but instead we have a proper replacement, Mr. Emmanuel Goffi, the Senior Associate at Ethicien du Numérique. Mr. Emmanuel will be showing us how bridging the gap is becoming essential in the modern age. So, Mr. Emmanuel, thank you very much, and you may welcome me here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I'm really sorry you might be disappointed not to see the first speaker that you were expecting. I will try to take over him the best way possible. Just because Alexander mentioned that, it's really important to keep in mind that he is totally right when he's saying that technology is ethically agnostic. And that's a really important point to all of us, and especially when working in the data field or artificial intelligence field, to understand that the responsibility is on our shoulders, not on the technical technologies or the AR, these kind of things, right? There are lots of misleading narratives about trustworthy AI, responsible AI, these kind of things, but just keep in mind that everything is about us, individually and collectively. So we'll try to speak a little bit about ethics here. As it has been mentioned, I'm an associate with a company that is called Ethicien du Numérique, digital ethicists, basically. And we are working with companies' organizations to obviously try to improve the implementation of ethics in their everyday AI or data-related activities. So on the screen, you can see a study that has been released quite recently here, and on which it is clearly stated what are the perceived disadvantages of implementing ethics in AI or data-related activities for companies' organizations. So obviously, a really just small number of people do feel like there is no disadvantage at all. But you can see that, for example, the biggest problems that companies do have with implementing ethics is the additional cost. There is one reason that is really interesting for that, is that most of the companies, organizations that I'm working with, they are not doing what we call ethics by design, meaning that they do not implement ethics from the ideation phase of their project, right? Mostly what happens is that they start their project, at some point they're looking for funds, investors, right? And then, for example, they apply for the European funds, H2020 programs, this kind of thing. And along the process, they are asked, what did you do at the ethical level? Why did you go through the Altai, the assessment tool that is provided by the European Union? What are the ethical issues that you've identified? How are you able to circumvent them or to fix those issues or to avoid them or mitigate risk and this kind of things, right? But they are already in the project. So they have to stop for a moment, and you know that time is money, and then they have to step back to the very beginning of their project, trying to see what they've done and what they've not done. Actually, mostly they haven't done most of the work, right? And so obviously it incurs a cost, right? It's time, and then you have to ask people like me to help you do the work. So that's basically where the cost is, right? The lack of, let's say, understanding or knowledge about the importance of doing ethics from the very beginning of the project, right? So obviously it's all about resources. Some really weird things are about, for example, competitiveness. That does not weakens competitiveness at all. We'll see that later. So what is all that about? The big issue that we have here has been identified by the World Economic Forum, that was 2019, 2020, right? And then a study has been conducted by IBM about what we call the intention-action gap. What most companies and organizations are doing when trying to implement ethics, they're doing what we call ethics shopping. Basically, oh, sorry, oh gosh, okay. What they're doing ethics shopping, which is basically what you can see on the bottom line of the slide, which is they go online, they go on Google, and they look at all the principles, so-called principles that are actually requirements of the European Union, 7 of them, right? So they just take them, they feel like, okay, we have to put that in our, let's say, code of ethics, we have to communicate on those requirements because we feel like this is what we have to do, right? But ethics shopping poses a big problem, which is most of the time, those requirements, those principles, they do not fit the needs and the interest of the companies and the organizations, right? So they're picking those requirements randomly without considering the fact that at some point they will have to operationalize them, right? So what happens is that you have the upper line, which is the intention. They endorse all those requirements. They put them into their code of ethics. They communicate about the fact that they are transparent, that they are accountable, that they value human control, these kind of things, right? But as you can see it, when it comes to put that into action, there is a big difficulty. And this is due to the fact that all those principles, they have been defined at the high level of abstraction by people that are the European Union, people that are really smart, indefinitely, but that they do not have a clear sense of what it takes to use those principles and to use them in the real life situation, right? They do not have any kind of sense of what companies, startups are dealing with, the issues that they have, right? So you have what we call this kind of abstraction inconsistency, which is from the outside, you can see that the principles are really high, right? But the operationalization of those principles is really low, right? Keep in mind, I don't know if you've read the recommendation by the European Union about trustworthy AI, where you will find those 7 requirements. The big idea with those 7 requirements is to build trust, right? It's all about trustworthy AI. The idea is to say we have to reassure consumers about the fact that we are implementing ethical processes in our activities to make sure that the AI product, the data that we're using, all the technology that we're developing is safe, right? That the risks are mitigated. That's the main point. But when you're doing that from the outside, if you're a consumer and you see this kind of gap between what people are saying, what they are pretending, and what they are really doing, then instead of building trust, you are actually endangering trust, right? Because you will not trust a company that is pretending to do something that they are not doing effectively, okay? So this is the big problem that we have today, and we have at some point to consider how to maybe narrow down this gap between the intention and action, okay? And that's where we are when we're talking about ethics, and this is what we call the OODA loop. I have a military background, and we use that in the military, obviously. And when we talk about OODA loop, it's all about how you can make the decision-making process shorter and more efficient, okay? And when it comes to implementing ethics into your AI-related activities, it's really important to have, a very decisive action at the orient stage. Why is that? Because most of the time what we do not understand is that it's not sufficient to be compliant and to tick boxes and to say, okay, I've done this, I have done that. You ask your jurist, you ask the lawyers of the company to check that. It's all about how people will act and react throughout the organization. Once again, it's a collective responsibility to be ethical or to act ethically. And it's all about how I will, let's say, push my people, my collaborators, to endorse the culture of ethics. Right? It's not about the technology that must be ethical. It's all about my collaborators, people that are working in my organization to be ethical. So you have to obviously work on what we call the mind programming of your people. You have to teach them. You have to explain them. You have to provide them with tools that will help them to obviously be more ethical, understand what ethics is, and then implement ethical processes, right? And once you have done that, you are able to create a culture of ethics based on what we call the common language. Mostly, what I can see working with organizations is that when we are setting, for example, the ethical committee, we have lots of people that are around the table. You have people from the legal field, you get technicians, engineers, you have the CEO, you have ethicists, you have programmers, you get a lot of people, human resources, etc., right? We are all talking about ethics. We are all using the word ethics. We are all using the same words about the requirements, which are accountability, etc., right? But behind each of these words, each person around the table is putting a different meaning, right? Because each person has a different perspective, different background, a different understanding of what those words are actually about. right? So if you are in this kind of situation, we are all using the same words, but we are not using the same meanings. And then what happens is that we are not able to find compromises. So then you have, once again, to make sure that people do have the same definition of what ethics is and what the requirements are about. So it's really important to work on what we call the mind programming, which is influencing people to make them understand what is at stake for you as a company, as an organization, what are the things that you will put in the ethical equation. So this is exactly where we have to work. In order to do that, there are basically 3 steps. The first one is training. There is a really big lack of training. Most startups we're working with, and especially with the European Union, they really discover that ethics is important, and when it's too late, when it's really too late. And sometimes they even have to stop their project, right? Because there are so many things that they have to fix that it would be impossible, that the cost would be too high, right? So at some point, they just have to drop their project, which is something that you don't want, obviously. So training from the very beginning is key about what is ethics, what is understood by ethics at the European Union level, what are the regulations that are at stake, what is the AI Act, what is the GDPR, what are the requirements, what are the definitions, all those things that are really missing for most companies today, right? So training is really key. It's key at the beginning, and then it is key along the process. Sometimes you have to update the knowledge of your collaborators. Sometimes you have to add more specific things to what they already know, and sometimes you also have to adjust to the evolution, for example, of the regulation. For example, that's the case with the forthcoming AI Act that is changing all the time. Then, once you've done training, you have to establish processes. Okay, you have to tell them, okay, that now that you know what ethics is, now that you understand what are the requirements, now that you have kind of a basic knowledge about the regulation, we'll provide you with processes that will help you to implement that, to make it real, to operationalize that, right? And then once you've done that, people will get used to use those processes, right? And at some point, it will become something natural. Right? And it will obviously make it easier for companies to implement ethics. Then you will stop losing time debating, discussing, explaining, and these kind of things. And you will see that the OODA loop will turn faster, right? And more efficiently, because it's not only about being faster, it's also about being more efficient. So you will gain lots of time, and you will gain a lot of money, obviously, on doing this kind of things. So when we're talking about methods, processes, and tools, there are some things that I've just wanted to offer you here that we are using, obviously. One of the most important things, and I will go back to that later, is deliberation, reflection, okay? Most of the time, companies are seeing ethics as a tool to avoid risks. Right? It's all about risk aversion in companies, and they see that ethics might be something that might mitigate risks, right? It's not only about the risks of, for example, using data that might lead to discrimination, these kind of things. It's much more about the risks that are related to the non-compliance to ethics, which might have a big impact on your reputation. When you're a big company, when you're a GAFA company or a BATEX company, you might survive this kind of reputational issue. But when you're a small company, when you're a startup, sometimes that might kill you, right? So it's much more about using ethics as a communication tool to say to the world, look, we are ethical, we are doing good, right? Even if sometimes, once again, the intention-action gap is really large. So the point is that most of those companies, they're doing compliance, which is the only first step of ethics. That's a necessary step, but it's definitely not a sufficient step, right? And now companies have to go beyond compliance. They have to go to deliberation. They have to go to what I call real ethics, right? So far, it has been mostly legal consideration. Now you have to go to the next step, which is about ethical considerations. And then you have to do deliberation. And deliberation is a really hard task. It's something that is difficult to do, to organize. You need to develop collaborative work on ethics which is also something that is really missing in most organizations. Quite often you have one person, two person that are responsible for ethics, right? And other people, other collaborators, they're not involved into the ethical deliberation or into the ethical decision-making process, which is a really bad idea. Because sometimes you might have really interesting feedbacks from people that are not in the field of ethics at all, people that are working in the human resources, right? They might bring you a perspective that might help you to improve your processes, right? And I've told you about the common language. That is really, really important. We try to establish common language, saying, okay, to companies, you have to decide what you mean by ethics. Some companies want to, I've worked with companies that want to dive really deep into ethics. They want to dive into the theories of ethics, consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. Sometimes international companies that are interested by multicultural perspective, from the animist perspective, Shinto perspective, Ubuntu perspective, etc., right? And then you also have other companies that are just like, okay, let's do ethics at the European Union level. What is ethics for regulators? What do they mean by ethics? What are the tools? What are the methods, etc.? So it depends on, obviously, the interest of the companies. You can work on this common language by providing them some insights and definitions about ethics and the consequences of implementing ethics in their work. And then regarding the processes, obviously the very first thing that we're doing, we're establishing ethical committees. So there are different size, different forms of ethical committees. So we just try to help them to decide who will be around the table, who will participate to the discussion, who will moderate the discussion, we will bring insight, we would just make use summaries of those discussions. Ethical committees are kind of a tricky things. Most of the time we have obviously the CEO, we have someone that is in the legal field, sometimes we have engineers, but mostly what is lacking are ethicists. And that's really something weird, is that most of the ethical reflection nowadays is conducted by either lawyers or computer scientists. Okay, I don't have anything against lawyers and computer scientists, that's not the point. But when you want to buy a good loaf of bread, you don't go to the butcher, even if the butcher knows how to make bread. Right? So ethicists are key, really, really key, and there is a strong need for much more ethics. The big problem is that you don't have that many ethicists around there. It's not a profession yet, so we're working on that, but really ethicists are lacking. If you look at the trustworthy AI recommendation, you will see something about a guy called Thomas Metzinger. He is a philosophy professor in Austria, and he was part of the high-level panel of experts that was writing this recommendation, right? And actually he left. He left, why? Because among the big group of experts, he was the only one who was a philosopher. And he said it was not about ethics, it was much more about lobbying, about all those industries that were trying to obviously promote their own interests, right? So ethicists are seen like, you know, people that will just jeopardize your work, which is not the case. But in the committees now, you need to have these kind of people. And then when it comes to the processes, we also talk about what we call ethics space. You need to provide ethics space to your collaborators, right? Sometimes what happened, and it happened to me once, it was a big company, French company, they discovered that actually people that were working with them, mostly engineers and programmers, they were not at ease with what the company was doing in terms of the product that they were developing and selling, right? And then they've seen some people that were facing moral dilemmas, had psychological issues, and then left, right? And when you have someone in your big company that has a psychological issue that is related to the ethics of the company, the risk is that this person will spread its fears and concerns around him, right? And then you will have big issues within the company. So this is where you need to offer a space, an ethical space to your collaborators to tell you in an anonymized way when they feel uncomfortable with what you're doing, or when they have concern about what they're participating to, right? And that's something that is really important, especially for big companies. It's easier to implement in small startups and small companies, obviously, but it's something that is really important. And then Regarding the tools, obviously there are lots of tools. You have the multi-level mapping of ethical risk, which is really important. Once again, it's all about the level of abstraction, where you trying to decide what are the risks. You will have the feedback processes. We do red teaming. I don't know if you've heard about red teaming. This is something that comes from the military. Red teaming is a group of people that are not specifically knowledgeable in AI, on data or ethics, these kind of things. You put them around a table, you provide them with a scenario, and then you say, okay, let's try to foresee what the possibilities might be, right, in 10, 20, 30 years. Right? And then those people, their work is about trying to foresee the scenarios that will pop up in the future, just to make you be prepared to them, right? And to anticipate them the best way possible. And also, I mentioned it at the very beginning of my talk, is ethics by design, which is really, really, really key, right? I think it happened only twice that companies contacted us from the very ideation phase of their project. Mostly what happens is that at some point they discover that they need ethics and they don't know how to deal with that, right? Then they call us, and once again, there is this big cost. So these are the kind of tools that we are using. Back to ethical deliberation, which is once again really key. There are methods for that, right? This is the 4-phase methods. 4-phase, 13 steps that we are using when we're doing that. It's something that is complex to understand at the very beginning, but once you've done it 2, 3, 4 times, it becomes something really easy, something really natural, right? So deliberation is really key because sometimes, and that's something that is clearly stated in the trustworthy AI guidelines, is that sometimes you will have requirements that will enter in confrontation with each other. And it already happened. For example, sometimes you cannot have at the same time privacy and transparency, right? And if you are in this situation, there is no way to find solutions in any of the European regulation. There is no solution in the AI trustworthy guidelines. You have to go through the deliberation process, right? And that's something that is really important to have these kind of methods with those steps, those phases, because as you know it, now you are expected to document everything you're doing in terms of ethics. And that might be reinforced by the AI Act. If something bad happens with a product that you've developed or with an activity that you've conducted, you will have to prove that you went through a specific process. So then you will have to document it. So if you have a method, a clear method, for example, those 4 phases, that might be something else, then you're able to follow those steps, and then you're able to document that, and then you can provide whoever needs it with those things. So there are 4 phases. The first one is about recognizing that there is an ethical issue, which is not always the case. Sometimes companies do deny that actually they have an ethical issue. Then you have to spot the ethical issue. You have to define what the dilemma is exactly, and then you have to define what are the values at stake, these kind of things. Then you clarify what are the conflicting values. So first you've identified the values, then you see what are the values that are confronting each other. Once again, that might be privacy and transparency. And then you try to understand what are the emotions behind that. And that's the interesting part when we're doing ethical deliberation, is that mostly when we're talking about values, people are putting themselves into the values, right? They're putting their emotions on the table, right? But when you are discussing with people that are putting their emotions, that have different emotions, you are not able to find a compromise. So then the job of the ethicist is just to bring that back to a rational thinking. Okay, you have your emotion, you have your ideas, you have your beliefs, great, but let's put that back to something that is rational, that might be used by the company to improve its processes, right? And then you will have to make this ethical decision making. Once you've rationalized that, you will see what are the values that are at stake. You will hierarchize those values. You say, okay, this value is higher than the other, and then you will try to find out ways to circumvent the ethical dilemma that you defined at the very beginning. And the last step, which is also really important, I was talking about the fact that you have to enlarge your ethical space, what we call also the ethical surface. It's also about discussing with outsiders and stakeholders you're working with. It's not only about your collaborators within the organization. You also have to discuss with outsiders, right? With providers, with investors, with partners, because you also need their feedbacks. And you also need to adjust to their requirement, to their needs, to their interest, and to their perspective, right? And then you will be able to create kind of an ethical network that will help you to do things better in the future. At the very end of the day, what happens is that the study that I've shown at the very beginning shows also, that's really interesting, that most of the companies that they've surveyed, they have a sense that ethics is important, right? But they have a really, really poor understanding of what ethics is. That's why they fear lots of things about ethics. While actually, when you're doing ethics, obviously the most important things is that it improves trust, right? And if you're able to improve trust with your consumers, with your investors, which is also a line that you can see here, obviously that's really good for your activities. I had myself a discussion with investors in the framework of the World Benchmarking Alliance, and investors were really, concerned about what could they do to make sure that companies they are investing in are doing things ethically, right? So meaning that it's a real concern from them, right? So if you're able to implement all those things from the very beginning, ethics by design, you're putting all those methods and processes in place in your organization, then that might have an impact on your consumers, because you will obviously lower the intention-action gap, and you will prove that you're not doing what I call cosmetics, which is using the words of ethics without doing ethics, right, which is mainly communication, but that you're doing ethics for real, right? And then you're creating this relation of trust with all stakeholders. And then you will definitely, and I can see that it's a really low number of people that do feel like it improves competitiveness, but now doing ethics for real is also seen as a niche, right? You don't have that many companies that are doing ethics for real. So that might be a way to improve your competitiveness at the international level. I think I'm done. Thank you for your attention. Great.
If maybe anybody has some questions, feel free to ask. Okay, and this is your certificate. Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Mikhail Roshkov. I'm interested in, do you have any framework or approach that helps to translate these ethical principles into the operational level for data scientists, machine learning engineers, in terms of some technical requirements or collaboration requirements that are easy to understand and implement into work?
I would say that it's a bad thing and a good thing for me is that no, there is no such thing as an easy translator to make that operationalized, right? So there are lots of studies, lots of work that has been done so far. I would recommend that you read, for example, Luciano Floridi's work on the operationalization, but it's academic work, it's really university writings, so it might be really complex to do that. This is where you need people that will help you to translate those kind of things. Once again, the big problem is that all those requirements, all those principles have been set at a really high level of abstraction. But there is no such thing as a tool that might help you to just translate that into something that is practical. For one good reason is that making it practical means that you really have to take into account the specific situation of your company. Then you have to decide, for example, the first thing that you have to decide is what is your ethical horizon? Where do you want to go, right? Because if you want to set a strategy, you need a specific and clear goal. And then you will define the strategy, and then you will define the steps to implement the strategy. And each time you will just take the principle and see how you can adapt them to your specific steps, knowing that you have a specific objective. Right? So it's something that you do through deliberation, something that you do with the ethical committee, but there is no such thing as something that would help you to do that automatically, I would say.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Okay.
Anybody else, maybe?
We're good?
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
This is yours. Thank you very much.